Hello, everyone. My name is Karin Sumis, Senior Curator at the Gardiner Museum. It's a pleasure to welcome you today to our annual Anne Walker Bell Lecture. Over 20 years ago, Robert Murray Bell and Anne Walker Bell donated a significant collection of Chinese blue and white porcelain to the Gardiner Museum, establishing Chinese ceramics as an important collecting area at the museum. We are extremely grateful for the family's continued support of this program. A few notes before we start our program. You may have noticed that your mics and videos are muted and that the chat option has been disabled. There will be a Q&A following today's lecture, so I invite you to send your questions using the Q&A function at any time during the talk. Although we are meeting virtually today, I would like to acknowledge that the Gardiner Museum operates on the traditional and ancestral land of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This land is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples from across Turtle Island. We are grateful to have the opportunity to learn and live on this land. We are thrilled to welcome Dr. Kristina Kleutghen as our speaker for today. Dr. Kleutghen is a specialist in Chinese art, particularly of the Qing dynasty. Her research investigates cross-cultural interaction, the imperial court, optical devices, and connections to science and mathematics. Her first book, Imperial Illusions, Crossing Pictorial Boundaries in the Qing Palaces, was published in 2015 by University of Washington Press. Her second book, The Local Exotic, Fabricating Foreign Taste in High Qing Court Decorative Arts, is currently under advanced contract with the University of Washington Press and currently under peer review. She also has a third book project, Lens Onto the World, Optical Devices, Art, Science, and Society in China, which is also under contract. Her lecture for today is entitled Shades of Gray, 18th Century Chinese Ink Color and Grisaille Porcelains in Cross-Cultural Context. So it's now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Kristina Kleutghen, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Karine. And hello, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your Thursday to join me in an exploration of the Gardiner's collection of Chinese art. So I will share my screen. And let's get started. So my talk today is titled Shades of Gray, 18th Century Chinese Ink Color and Grisaille Porcelains in Cross-Cultural Context. The Gardiner holds a fascinating and exceptional pair of Chinese porcelain plates that raise different questions about the role that interaction between painting and porcelain in the materiality of cross-cultural contact between Europe and China during the 18th century. The plates depict a pair of quails together with chrysanthemums in black and sepia enamel with a dense textile pattern border overlaid with gilded symmetrical Rococo forms. And as we shall see, this combination of motifs and the representational technique used to depict them also blends European and Chinese patterns and images in surprising ways. But these plates also allow us to look at several other aspects of cross-cultural encounter, such as the new imperially sponsored enamel technologies that developed during the first third of the 18th century. And that is really what made those enamels possible. We'll also look at the relationship between Chinese ink monochrome painting and European prints, as well as the use of printed and painted models for 18th century Chinese export porcelains. So ultimately, this pair of plates serves as a case study for examining much larger issues surrounding the ways in which China and Western Europe encountered each other during the 18th century through paintings, prints, and porcelain. So first, let's take a good close look at the plates. Let's identify what is represented, and let's place those images in context. So in the center of both plates is what in traditional Chinese painting would be called an ink monochrome painting in the bird and flower genre of two quails in an autumn landscape. The season is identifiable by the presence of blooming chrysanthemums, and we might go further and actually call it late autumn, given how few leaves are left on the short spiky branches of a bush in which one of the quails sits upright, preening its feathers. The chrysanthemum petals are each individually outlined in black enamel, and either left unpainted or only very lightly touched with sepia enamel. And that gives this sense of pale, feathery blossoms unfurling from the flower's cores. The two quails are rendered in the same palette of black, gray, and sepia enamels, which take advantage of the glazed white porcelain substrate on which they are painted to inject white into the palette that's used to render the bird's feathers. Each feather, regardless of what type or where on the bird's bodies it's found, retains a narrow, visible band of unenameled porcelain that separates it from the other feathers. And this gives a sense of overlapping plumage, particularly on the backs and the breasts of the birds. While the plant components that we see in the bottoms of both of these detail images here are all meticulously outlined with fine lines, the quails are more typically rendered without outlines for most of their bodies in a more boneless style of painting, which either omits a dark outline or outlines forms in the same color used to fill them in. And this creates a much softer effect that is especially good for suggesting the softness and fluffiness of bird feathers. Only the quail's eyes, beaks, and legs are firmly outlined. And this reflects the harder edges of those features in real life compared to the feathers. The birds are first painted in sepia enamel on top of the glazed porcelain, and then darker or even black Z-shaped marks are added on top of the back feathers to suggest both the darker patterns on top of the generally lighter feathers, as well as a greater variety of overglaze enamel colors that were actually used, which is really only two colors of enamel, black and sepia, that are just very carefully placed to incorporate the pure white of the glazed porcelain surface underneath. And this is done in the exact same way as an ink monochrome bird and flower painter would have manipulated ink and light organic colors on the surface of paper or silk to integrate the surface's pale color into the overall palette of the painting. But the combination of quail and chrysanthemums is more than just birds and flowers. It is also a visual rebus for an auspicious wish for the viewer, and this relies on homophones that link the first syllable of the word for quail, which you can see on the screen here, with the word for peace, pronounced the same way but written differently, and stretching the pronunciation of the first syllable ju of the word chrysanthemum towards the word for live, which is ju. And then that gives us together the quail and the chrysanthemum create a visual rebus for the phrase live and work in peace and contentment, anju le ye. And this creates a picture of a very well-known and recognized positive sentiment without writing a single character. The homophonic possibilities of the word for quail mean that quails are frequently paired with other flora and fauna to create visual rebuses for auspicious wishes in traditional Chinese art. And you can find these rebuses not just on porcelains, but also on textiles and other materials. It really crosses materials and media. But on this case, I've given you several examples of different rebuses. So let's go through these all on porcelain. Now, besides the wish for living and working in peace and contentment, I've got three other examples for us from the 18th century. These are all imperial court ceramics marked for the use of either the Yongzheng or Qianlong emperors who reigned consecutively from 1723 through the end of the 18th century. Second from left is a stem cup with the wish for peace in all four seasons. And that's created by the combination of a quail with the Chinese rose. Second from right, the blue and white porcelain octagonal flask shows two quail with chrysanthemums to their left, but also a gracefully arcing ear of grain that droops elegantly over the scene due to the weight of its abundance. The combination of the quail and the ear of grain therefore creates the rebus peace year after year, thanks to the homophones of grain and year. On the right, the bowl, and I've given you two views, it combines the chrysanthemum, the rose, and the grain motif with not two quails, but 9, and adds a long-tailed pheasant, too. The 9 quails alone create one rebus for peace forever, while the pheasant is a rebus for the phrase long running or long reigning, in the case of the Yongzheng emperor for whom this pair or this bowl was made. The 9 quails together with the pheasant produce the rebus everlasting peace, while the roses, chrysanthemums, and ears of grain continue to contribute their auspicious wishes in what might be considered the maximum concentration of quail-related homophonic rebuses on a single vessel. Now, on the Gardiner plate, the combination of quail and chrysanthemum motifs, the symbolic message they represent through homophonic symbology and similarities in the Chinese language, and the ink monochrome painterliness with which they were rendered all point to traditional styles and models meant to appeal to a familiar consumer. But the treatment of the borders surrounding the central seams on the plate's rims and cavettos suggest a different set of models and intended consumers. On the bottom half of the plate, the ground plane of the landscape foreground extends into that well, which is painted with a geometric swastika fret pattern. We have a detail of that on the right. Now, this pattern, which is commonly used in textiles, is based around the traditional, historical, auspicious, and positive symbolism of the swastika, both as a Buddhist symbol and as a symbol of infinity in a stylized form of the character meaning 10,000 or myriad. On the woven kneeling mat shown here, from which the previous detail was cropped, you can see that the swastika fret pattern is overlaid with a pattern of bats, because the word for bat is itself a homophone with the word for auspicious. And so you can see the entirely positive associations of the swastika in the textile pattern, as well as how the 4 legs of the swastika motif itself extend into the 4 lines that link each swastika horizontally and vertically into a pattern that seems to suggest larger woven structure. And that adds remarkable dynamism and dimension to a pattern that is actually very simple, entirely linear, and created with only 2 contrasting colors. The swastika fret pattern is restrained from extending into the center of the plate by a gold enamel border that is shaped into a sort of pointed lobe, and that punctuates the entire center of the plate 8 times around with a shape that we can identify as an auspicious Ruyi cloud or Lingzhi fungus. And this all points inwards towards the quail and chrysanthemum scene. You can see that the swastika fret pattern extends across the plate's wide border, but the ring at the edge between the border and the well is painted with a repeating pattern of wavy double sepia lines crossing over a ring of unenameled porcelain that itself is framed by 2 additional rings of black enamel. This combination creates the impression of a wide black and white cord wrapped in narrower cord, creating a strikingly 3-dimensional effect thanks to the overlapping lines and juxtaposition of lighter and darker spaces. Evenly spaced around the plate's borders and aligned with 4 of those pointed, auspicious cloud-shaped forms are 4 European-style symmetrical leafy scrolls extending out from a central bud. And these are outlined and modeled with very, very fine black ink lines, but filled in with gold. And it's that bright color and reflectivity that enhances the luster of the glazed porcelain. The roundness of the exuberantly curled and curved leaves contrasts with the stark geometry of the swastika fret background pattern. But because this scrolling floral's stylized and symmetrical rendering is still markedly abstracted from real flora and fauna, its representation is therefore significantly different from the ways in which the quail's feathers and the chrysanthemum petals are depicted in the center of the plates. So when we zoom back out of the original motifs and their meanings, and we look at these objects holistically, we can now see that there are several types of art at play. So if we work from the center of the plates outward, you can see that we are dealing with, of course, Chinese ink monochrome paintings, and specifically paintings in the bird and flower genre. The fact that we are dealing with overglaze enameled porcelains means that we also need to look at the development of that technology in the first third of the 18th century, because that new technology is what made the application of black and sepia enamel on porcelain possible. And when we consider these plates as examples of cross-cultural interaction in porcelain during the 18th century, we also need to consider where they sit relative to export porcelain, which is produced for, in the 18th century, European and eventually American markets. We also need to look particularly at porcelains painted in grisaille or in black and sepia enamels. So these three areas, ink monochrome painting, particularly the bird and flower genre, overglaze enamel technology, and export porcelains, are where we will turn next to better understand the Gardiner's plates within the bigger picture of 18th century Chinese art. Bird and flower painting is a genre that includes not only birds and flowers, but also insects, fish, small reptiles, and occasionally small cats and dogs, so household pets. Figures are notably absent. While it first developed during the Tang Dynasty, so 7th to 10th centuries, it reached its first height as an independently practiced and appreciated genre during the 10th century, a period of disunion known as the Five Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms for all of the different states founded and fallen during that single century. This period is also one of incredible productivity and creativity for painting, and one that had a profound effect on many genres, but especially on landscapes and bird and flower. The two artists that you see on the screen here, who are Huangquan and Xu Xi, they are considered two of the most important and influential. They also epitomize the two very different styles in which the genre was practiced. Huangquan, on the left, who worked for the Shu Kingdom in Sichuan province, he was known for his meticulously drawn and vibrantly colored life studies, with an emphasis on detail and realistic representation. On the right, Xu Xi, who we know much less about, but nevertheless we are clear that he was not a court official like Huangquan. Well, Xu Xi worked in a very different style that relied more on the expressive possibilities of ink and light colors that sought to sketch the idea of the subject rather than depict its strict reality in detail. These two approaches had a profound influence on later artists and continue to provide the two major stylistic frameworks for bird and flower painting for more than 1,000 years, and that does include the Gardiner's two plates. Huangquan's meticulous observational style became the foundation for the bird and flower painting that took place at the Song Dynasty court, which is often considered the height of early bird and flower painting. But here we have it exemplified in the work of the Northern Song Emperor Huizong. He reigned for about the first quarter of the 12th century. His painting here, Finches and Bamboo, nevertheless shows us how ink and subtle tones might play a key role in that meticulously observed style. Huizong's finches are presented without much of a firm black ink line, more of a slightly toned line relative to the tone of the ink or the pigment used to create that part of the bird. But they also take advantage of the natural color of the silk. And the silk is here rather yellowed with age, rather than the much brighter and paler tone as originally. But it still gives us a sense of how a lighter color can create the look of pale breast feathers without requiring the application of white pigment. If you look closely, you might see that the bird's eyes are darker and shinier than their body feathers. This is achieved with a drop of lacquer on the surface of the painting in both of those cases, and that creates a wonderfully reflective sphere that catches the light in the same way that a pupil does. And that really enhances our impression of the bird's realism. Finches and Bamboo shows us how meticulous attention to rendering realistic detail, even when painted mostly in ink and sepia-colored vegetal pigments, can persist and grow even 2 centuries after the work of Huangquan. We find an example of true monochrome ink bird and flower painting in the work of the painter Wang Yuan, who was active during the 14th century. And here we have a wonderful painting of quails in an autumn scene that's held in the Cleveland Museum of Art. But what Wang Yuan has done here is to use only shades of ink to meticulously depict the birds and flowers in this painting, most notably for our interest, the quails and the chrysanthemums, while retaining the use of more abstracted texture strokes and ink washes for the landscape elements, such as that central garden rock. The quail's feathers and bodies are carefully delineated but also softened with tones of ink, while the chrysanthemum petals are individually outlined and striated, yet not filled in with ink, thereby using that unpainted paper to suggest white petals. And so you're starting to see how some of that careful observation but also sketchier representation of ideas can be combined in the work of ink monochrome painters. With the establishment of the Ming Dynasty in 1368 and succeeding the Mongol Yuan Dynasty, bird and flower painting returned to the imperial court as part of an effort to revive Song Dynasty styles and to counteract what was perceived as a discontinuity caused by the intervening Mongol rule. But during the 15th century, in addition to the bright colors, realism, and precise outlines in the work of court painters such as Bian Wenjin and Lu Ji, we also have the work of court painter Lin Liang, who painted only in water and ink. As you can see from this painting of hawks in a thicket, Lin generally preferred to work freehand in a more calligraphic style that combines relatively simple brushwork, actually, with ink washes in all tones of that spectrum, and only the occasional addition of sepia. Here is that touch of sepia in the eyes of the two hawks. Lin Liang was a professional court painter, but the style that you see here was ideal for the scholar amateur painter. This is a casually freehand, more descriptive style that was nevertheless possible only after years of working with brush and ink and really knowing your materials. Lin Liang contributed significantly to ink monochrome, bird, and flower painting, and we see the legacy established by Xu Xi in the 10th century that continues through artists like Wang Yuan through to Lin Liang in the Gardiner's plate. And as we've already experienced together, truly engaging with this type of painting requires a great deal of focus and close looking at individual brushstrokes on the surface, and indeed rewards that attention with new discoveries again and again. So it's a persistent opportunity to marvel at how so few colors can create so many tones and textures. So now we've begun filling in our Venn diagram, and I want to turn from painting on paper with ink and silk to painting with overglaze enamels on porcelain. And the development of that technology is ultimately what made it possible to paint birds and flowers in an ink monochrome style on the Gardiner's plates. During the 16th century, under the Ming Dynasty, a type of porcelain decoration was developed called wucai, meaning 5 colors, and this refers to a limited palette of overglaze colors dominated by red, green, and yellow, painted onto vessels already partially decorated with underglaze cobalt blue, and then fired to fuse those pigments with the glazed porcelain surface. More than 5 colors were used. As you can see here, we have a lovely rich brown, but these are translucent enamels. They could achieve only a limited range of color, a very limited range of tone and gradation, and really no meaningful shading. To achieve those characteristics, we had to wait until the start of the 18th century with the development of opaque overglaze painted enamels, and those are what led to the famous Famille Rose palette that comes to define Qing Dynasty porcelains. All of this is taking place during what is known as the High Qing era, established by the Kangxi Emperor, who reigned from 1661 to 1722. The development of those painted enamels began under Kangxi, but then they developed to their full potential under his son and successor, the Yongzheng Emperor, who had a very short 13-year reign in between that of his father and his son. But the development of overglaze opaque enamels was brought to new heights of imperial innovation and quality, as well as mass production for export porcelains during the reign of the Qianlong Emperor. And it's under his reign that we finish out the 18th century. So this whole period of China's long 18th century and these three successive rulers is often known as the Golden Age of late imperial China during its last dynasty. Beginning in the late 17th century, at the start of the Kangxi reign, now Kangxi, who was extremely interested in European culture, mathematics, and science, he developed a particular fascination with European glass and enameled metalwares, which he received first as diplomatic gifts from European embassies and missionaries, but cultivated in him an interest that led to his support for establishing an imperial glassworks in the 1690s, and that laid the foundation for the Qing domestic production of both enamel pigments and enameled porcelains. During the 1710s, Kangxi discovered that a few Chinese artisans in the southern port city of Canton, otherwise known as Guangzhou, and this is where the European trade ships docked, he discovered that a few Chinese artisans in that city were already producing enameled objects and had them come to court in Beijing, bring their enamel pigment formulas and their practice techniques into the court milieu. The result of Kangxi's imperial interest, effectively unlimited financial support, and the unsurpassed skills of the Qing court artists and artisans meant that by the end of the Kangxi reign in 1722, the Qing imperial court workshops produced painted enamels on a variety of substrates, on metal and glass and red stoneware ceramics as in Europe, but also on porcelain. These early Qing painted enamelwares were limited almost entirely to the imperial court. And as you can see from this selection here, they really emphasize the new enamel palette of pink, yellow, blue, and opaque white above other colors. Black enamel does appear during the Kangxi reign, as you can see from that metal box on the top left, but it is rare relative to the more typical and much brighter color palette. And typically during Kangxi enamels, you can find black as an all-over ground color rather than as a tool for painting or creating ink monochrome landscapes. Now, it's not that there wasn't availability of black glazes on porcelain. There absolutely were, and we even see black glazed ceramics painted with gold after the glaze was fired on. These are being produced at the Jingdezhen imperial kilns, but again, the ability to paint on porcelain using black and shades of gray with pigments that would survive kiln firing had not yet been achieved during the Kangxi reign. And early in 1722, the Jesuit Father d'Entrecol recorded that at Jingdezhen, specifically that they had attempted to paint some vessels with what he described as the finest China ink, but unsuccessfully, because after firing, d'Entrecol found that the vessels were entirely white. All of the pigment had burned away, and so the artists and artisans supposed that the black color was still insubstantial, it was dissipated by the action of the kiln firing, or it just wasn't strong enough generally. So at least in 1722, which is the very end of the Kangxi reign, we still don't have the ability to paint the sort of monochrome scenes that we see on the Gardiner's plates. That use of black enamel as a generally all over color ground, it did continue with Kangxi's successor, the Yongzheng Emperor. And we see a number of extant early 18th century imperial wares that incorporate black enamel, regardless of their substrate. But these are actually a phenomenon that I've connected with the Yongzheng Emperor's particular fascination with Japanese lacquerwares and his support for mimicking the look of especially black and gold Japanese lacquers in Qing examples, whether that was with ceramic glazes or enamel painting. But it's under Yongzheng that we come to understand through new research that the pigments used on Kangxi's enamelwares were often produced domestically, even if some ingredients were imported. So when we combine scientific testing with archival research and art historical analysis, we have come to understand the chemical signatures of these enamel pigments and can pin down their origins in China or in Europe much more concretely than we have been previously able to do. And this is cutting edge research that's being done by scholars both in Europe and in China, as well as Julie Belmer at the Corning Museum of Glass. So during the 1710s and early 1720s, we now have come to understand that overglaze enamels on porcelain were painted in Beijing, typically by imperial court artisans using imperial quality blanks, made, fired, and given a clear glaze at the imperial porcelain manufactory at Qing. Now, that division of labor across the kilns and the court painting workshop in the capital reveals the limits that still existed during the early phase of painted enamel wares in, say, the second and third decades of the 18th century. But during the Yongzheng reign, his imperial support, together with the presence of a particular pair of technocrats who were appointed as supervisors to the imperial kilns, meant that by 1735, we have a full array of overglaze enamel pigments, as well as the technology to fix them to glazed porcelain. So the technological advancements that occurred happened so fast that we have, in the space of about 20 years, imperial quality overglaze enameled porcelains produced start to finish at the Qing imperial kilns. One of those technocrats is named Tang Ying, and he is typically credited with many, if not all, of the major technological developments in glazing and enameling ceramics that occurred during the Yongzheng reign in the 1720s and early 30s. And thanks to Tang Ying, we now not only know that there were two kinds of black glazed porcelains developed, one imitating European models and another imitating Japanese models, but also that artisans had achieved the knowledge and abilities to paint porcelains with scenes that appeared as if rendered in ink monochrome on paper or silk, hence ink color porcelains. This technological advancement also made it possible to render both painting and calligraphy in an ink-like mode. 17th century innovations led to a more painterly approach to ceramics generally, and treating the three-dimensional bodies of vessels as surfaces for painting in a more traditional sense also meant bringing in that historically specialized brushwork vocabulary and traditional genres, such as landscapes and bird and flowers. During the 17th century, those scenes were rendered in underglaze cobalt blue rather than black, and that maintained a distance from those more elite arts of painting and ink monochrome calligraphy by virtue of the color differences. When we transcend those obstacles in producing, applying, and firing Chinese overglaze enamel pigments onto porcelains, by the Yongzheng reign, we can see with these two examples on the screen that black enamel had reached its full potential, not only as a dramatic all-over ground cover, but also as the material able to create truly painterly scenes that captured the artist's skill and the profound complexity of the spectrum of ink monochrome tones that you can achieve. And here we have a combination of black and sepia on white porcelain. But take a look at the distant mountains. They are only faintly visible. Nearer peaks are rendered in washes that range in tone and texture strokes that are drawn from the long history of traditional landscape painting. Now, these examples are both purely Chinese subject matters, but the European origins of painted enamels also brought with them important and persistent connections to European ideas, which the Qing emperors easily adapted and developed to fit their own personal tastes and interests. When I first encountered the Gardiner's pair of quail and chrysanthemum plates, what immediately sprang to mind is a pair of Yongzheng-era teapots, which are an important example of this type of black and sepia painting on porcelain that does not follow a traditional Chinese approach, but is blended with components that do. Each vessel in this pair of similar but not identical overglazed enamel teapots also bears a 4-character Yongzheng imperial reign mark, indicating that it was made for his use. And it's painted with 2 cartouches of bird and flower themes that include the same basic elements in different compositions. On one side of each teapot, we have a framed image depicting a pair of magpies, together with chrysanthemums, Chinese roses, and bamboo. A pair of magpies is often a positive and auspicious symbol that creates a homophone for marital bliss and fidelity, but magpies are also treated as harbingers of good news, and that adds the idea of coming or coming soon to the other symbols in the scene that are already familiar. In both of these cartouches, black enamel has been used to write 2 lines praising the bird's feathers and describing them as present throughout the bamboo forest. And the second set of cartouches on these teapots are a pair of quails together, again, with our familiar friends, the Chinese roses and heavy ears of grain. As you already know, these are rebuses, meaning peace in all four seasons and peace year after year. These panels include text appreciating the persistent abundance of grain. And that is particularly important for Yongzheng. When you think about the combination of the abundance of grain, that's an auspicious sign for an emperor that all is right with the world. When you combine that with the presence of the quails as a homophone for peace and tranquility, we see a wish that runs as a way to counteract the Yongzheng emperor's perpetual struggle to confirm that he was indeed the legitimate heir to the Kangxi emperor and did indeed possess the mandate of heaven that confirmed divine approval of his rule. And so auspicious symbols like the quail and the abundant grain acquire an extra layer of political symbolism in the case of the Yongzheng emperor himself. The combination of the magpies and quails together also create one more rebus for double happiness and double peace. And that makes the two frame scenes individual components in a larger message that wraps around the entire bodies of the vessels and amplifies the individual wishes in the cartouche scenes. Just as important as those cartouche scenes, though, is the dense ground pattern that covers the bodies and lids of these two teapots. We have a dense pattern that was first outlined in black lines, fine black lines with enamel, and then the curling leaves are very, very delicately filled in with enamel that shades into sepia and gray. The largest motifs are lotuses that are only faintly tinted, creating the perception of white flowers that stand out against that darker background, while also adding depth and dimension to each large blossom. The density of the all-encompassing curling flowers, vines, and leaves is a decorative idea imported from European enamel wares, and it appears occasionally in 18th century imperial enamels on both copper and porcelain, but in full color rather than in black and sepia. The fact that it is rendered in this more neutral, subdued palette for imperially marked enameled porcelains is what makes this pair of teapots so special as an early example of overglazed enameled porcelains that incorporate European elements in black and sepia enamel created not for export, but specifically for the Yongzheng emperor. So if we return again to our diagram and we recenter ourselves around the Gardiner's plates, we know not only where the styline ideas behind the central motif of quail and chrysanthemums originated, but also that explicitly imperial support for the research, development, and early production of overglaze enamel pigments and firing technologies that made it possible to paint both the central scene and the complex swastika fret and wrapped cord patterns that frame it. Yet we're still missing one piece of the puzzle, namely export porcelain produced for Western markets, because these dishes fall more into that category than any other, and because porcelains painted in Grisaille were produced by far more often for foreign rather than domestic consumers. China has a long history of producing ceramics for foreign markets and consumers, and marine archaeology confirms that ships carrying ceramics intended specifically for South Asian and Middle Eastern markets were ferrying wares designed and decorated to meet those consumers' demands. Those ships were leaving Chinese ports at least as early as the Tang Dynasty, again, 7th to 10th century. China continued to produce ceramics for other markets around Asia and the Islamic world for the next several centuries, growing significantly during the 16th and 17th centuries to include not just other places in Asia and the Islamic world, but also Europe. And as you can see from just these three pieces in the Gardiner's own collection, forms were often targeted to the particular cultural practices and the foodways of those markets, whether large dishes for communal eating in the Islamic world, or forms like the mustard pot in 17th century Europe that took metalware forms and transformed them into blue and white porcelain. Now today, when I talk about export ceramics, I'm speaking here about wares and designs that were produced for markets in Europe and eventually, by the end of the 18th century, markets in the newly established United States as well. And I want us to focus specifically on export porcelains painted in those tones of black and sepia that either suggest grisaille or enamels that actually are in just the grisaille palette. If you want to study this category of export porcelains, many sources focus on making a connection to image models that were drawn from European prints. And so there's a lot of emphasis in this study on finding the models and creating the paper design that was ultimately used as the basis for the export works. And European prints were not only circulating in 17th and 18th century China, but they were already being used at the Qing kilns for models, as well as being sent with orders for porcelains from European companies, as well as individual consumers who wanted a particular subject. In the 18th century, Chinese export porcelains might just as readily be painted in the Canton factories as in Qing, and they reflect a wide range of styles, artistic abilities, and price points. But there are certain major categories into which many of the extant Grisaille painted export porcelains can be grouped. European engravings clearly played a key role in driving images painted in this palette. Birds and flowers do appear, but they're much less represented as a category. I have a notable exception for you here with a set depicting tropical birds and vultures from about 1740 that are based on engravings by a 17th century painter and designer. During the 18th century, one major category was mythological scenes from antiquity, such as those seen here where we have Herculean labors, the immersion of Achilles into the river Styx, and Eos, goddess of the dawn, driving a chariot pulled by winged horses. Christian religious imagery is another major category, and while these wares are sometimes referred to as Jesuit wares, the Jesuit missionaries, especially those in China and specifically a few serving in the imperial painting academies of the High Qing courts, they were not involved in either painting or designing such scenes for porcelain decoration. Famous scenes and views might also be represented, and those are scenes both at home and abroad, such as the Oxford Botanical Garden entrance gate, which was constructed after designs by Inigo Jones. And if you have a famous scene abroad, you might as well choose the European warehouses in Canton, which were known as factories. And this is where goods were stored before loaded onto ships for the various European markets served by the many different East Asia companies. And you can see several of the flags identifying those Canton factories here on the bowl. We also have some extraordinary, unique, and bespoke commissions, such as this punch bowl depicting a faithful replica of the engraved membership of the Society of Cincinnati that was issued to one Ebenezer Stevens. And the document is dated December 1785. So that gives us a really nice way to help date the bowl to the last half of the 1780s. The underside of this bowl is also inscribed Sinchong, which is the same name as the Chinese business associate who the first major American China trader, Samuel Shaw, considered to be the principal porcelain merchant at Canton. So we currently think it refers to that man rather than an artist. Armorial porcelains are a large category of Chinese export porcelains, including within Grisaille wares. But here I want to highlight an armorial set that combines those emblems with Chinese-style painting, as in these two plates from the Elwick service, which is a large service created for John Elwick of London, and he was a director of the English East India Company. The Elwick service plates superimpose the Elwick coat of arms on a traditional Chinese ink landscape, surrounded by densely brocaded pattern borders and cartouched scenes in composition that recalls the density of visual material found on the Gardiner's quail and chrysanthemum plates. If we zoom in to the central landscape scenes on these Elwick plates, we can also see differences in style and skill, as well as subtle differences in the composition. But the jarring juxtaposition of ink monochrome landscape and full color coat of arms is here meant to strengthen the expression of Elwick's authentic experience as a successful China trader. The landscape scenes, however, did not originate in European prints, and they include many of the classic features of Chinese traditional ink monochrome landscape painting: overlapping rocks, vertical composition that represents horizontal spatial representation by extending up the picture plane rather than deep into space, and a minimal but still noticeable human presence that nevertheless emphasizes the grandeur of the surrounding landscape. And it's this idea of Chinese models that helps return us to the gardener's plate and to consider where its quails and chrysanthemums sit in the larger scheme of export porcelains. The use of auspicious quail and vegetation patterns is not at all uncommon in the larger scheme of export porcelains. And indeed, the use of auspicious quail here, we have them in both Japanese Kakiemon style export porcelains from the 17th century that were produced for Europe during a time when China's Jingdezhen kilns were not running. And so the Dutch, who were the only ones whose ships would have access to Japan during that period, they began importing Japanese porcelains from the Arita kilns, such as the plate on the left from the Gardiner's collection. And here on the left, that abundant era of grain has been moved to the left. The chrysanthemums now arc over the scene from the right, appearing as if on the end of bamboo stalks, and they're paired with blossoming plums. All of these are still traditional symbols for longevity and rejuvenation, but now separated from that ear of grain. And the distinctive Kakiemon style palette of red, green, and blue overglaze painted Arita porcelains seems to have been a popular choice for European imitations of this pattern, and that extended through the 18th century. You can see in this other Gardiner example from the English Bow porcelain works, datable to the mid-18th century. That's rather after the height of Japanese export porcelain in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, but it also demonstrates the persistent appeal of these patterns and palettes after the establishment of both soft paste and hard paste porcelain factories in 18th century Europe. In Chinese export porcelain, we continue to find the combination of quail and chrysanthemums together with these popular and colorful Japanese elements after the development of overglaze enamel pigments in what we call the famille rose palette of pinks, yellows, blues, and opaque white enamels. These two plates from the Gardiner and Victoria and Albert Museums, respectively, both depict the same basic pattern of the quail and chrysanthemum, but they've added the stylized blossoming plum and bamboo from the Japanese Kakiemon style patterns. While those additional motifs incorporate also the type of vibrant coloration found on the Japanese export porcelains, including the uses of green and blue for plant stems and leaves, the Chinese examples don't use that warm Japanese red, but rather multiple shades of ruby pink, this paler pink enamel created by mixing opaque white with darker red. There's also no abundant ear of grain in this pattern, which instead just relies on the paired quails and chrysanthemums, and they're framed and bolstered by the blossoming plum that has replaced the grain in arcing over the scene. So if we compare this famille rose palette quail and chrysanthemum export plate with our black sepia and gold plate, we can make several observations. The subtlety of the monochrome image immediately casts the skill of that painter into sharp relief, particularly the precision of brushwork that makes possible both the softness of the feathers and the crisp linearity of the textile patterned border. By contrast, the more colorful plate on the right relies on the vibrancy of the palette and the oversized flowers for its visual appeal. The plate on the right is far easier to look at quickly, while the black and sepia enameled plate rewards close looking and appreciation of the brushwork in the same manner used for the more elite art of painting on paper or silk. Both still combine Chinese and European interests in overglaze enameled porcelain during the 18th century, yet the experiences of these two plates are completely different due to their painting styles and color palettes. And so if we return one final time to our diagram, we have now completed the puzzle. The Gardiner's pair of mid-18th century quail and chrysanthemum plates communicate to us through style and subject, although whether the full message of the rebus made by pairing these birds with those flowers, whether that was completely clear to consumers is not something we can necessarily rely on if we assume a European consumer. Nor should we rely on a European consumer being aware of the long history of Chinese bird and flower painting dating back to the 10th century. Indeed, how could they have been familiar with that history? But also just how familiar with that history were the artists, the Chinese artists who painted that decoration? These are questions we will probably never be able to answer, but that's all right. Because in the 21st century, with the benefit of hindsight and a fully cross-cultural perspective on these works, within a broader art historical context that cuts across materials and formats, we ourselves can achieve the full picture. So treating the Gardiners' Grisaille and gilt quail and chrysanthemum plates like paintings as much as like porcelains shows us just how extraordinary these two objects are and offers new insights into how complex the Gardiners' plates are as objects that epitomize cross-cultural connections between China and Europe in the 18th century. Thank you very much.